I still remember the moment he pointed at me, his voice loud enough to pierce the quiet murmur of the coffee shop. "This is my ex, a worthless community college dropout," Ethan said, grinning in a way that made my stomach twist. And there was Courtney beside him, Ethan's new girlfriend, a corporate lawyer who looked utterly uncomfortable, as if he hadn't signed up for public humiliation. I forced a smile, keeping my voice steady, though my heart raced. "Hope you're happy," I said quietly to myself and walked toward a corner table, trying to steady my shaking hands. The world felt surreal, like someone had shifted all the furniture inside my chest while I wasn't looking. Hours later, a corporate announcement I stumbled upon only added to the shock. The name on the screen made my chest tighten further, confirming that my quiet life had somehow collided spectacularly with theirs. Part of me burned with anger, yet another part felt pity. Pity for Ethan, who had built his sense of worth entirely on credentials and appearances, blind to what truly mattered. We had spent 18 months together, sharing days and nights, dreams and laughter, and he had measured my value against his narrow definitions of success. And the irony was cruel. Ethan mocked me, flaunted his new girlfriend, and publicly relished my failures. Yet he had no idea that I was quietly creating something extraordinary. TaskFlow, the productivity app I developed, was now used daily by Ethan's company, driving the very work he bragged about to Courtney. Every project he proudly completed relied on something I had built, something he didn't even notice. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my chest ease just a little. "Life has a way of balancing the scales," I whispered, and I couldn't help but wonder, how long before he realized just how wrong he had been. I was 24 when I first met Ethan. I had just moved to the city after finishing community college. Well, technically, after dropping out of it, but I had plans. Big ones, even if the world didn't yet notice. I worked from home, building small apps and experimenting with productivity tools, living a modest life that some might call unimpressive. But I didn't care much for appearances. I cared about what I created, what I could bring into the world. Ethan, on the other hand, was everything I wasn't, or at least everything the world seemed to admire. Tall, confident, effortlessly polished. He worked in marketing at a pharmaceutical company, and he had this way of walking into a room that made people take notice. He was charming, smart, and somehow he noticed me. I remember it vividly, a rainy Thursday at a mutual friend's gallery opening. My umbrella had flipped inside out, my hair was damp and frizzy, and I was fumbling with my coat. Ethan offered me his, with a teasing smirk and a warmth in his eyes that made me almost forget the wet mess I was in. Our first 18 months were intoxicating. Dates at small cafes, late-night coding sessions, where he pretended to understand my app ideas, weekend hikes, quiet nights talking about dreams that seemed impossible. I loved how he laughed at my dry humor, how he noticed the little things, my obsession with color coding, the way I hummed when I focused, even the odd socks I sometimes wore. But cracks appeared slowly, almost imperceptibly. Around the 12th month, he began making offhand comments about my lifestyle. "Emily, don't you think it's time you wore something a bit professional?" he'd suggest, after seeing me in my favorite worn hoodie during a lunch date. Or, "Maybe you should network more. Meet people who are actually going places." At first, I laughed it off, thinking it was harmless teasing, but the comments became sharper, more frequent. I also felt the subtle pressure from his family. His younger sister once asked why I didn't have a real job, and his mother hinted during brunch that a woman with ambition should have more credentials. I tried to explain that I was working on my own projects, that my app, TaskFlow, was growing steadily, but the words sounded hollow against their judgmental gazes. There were moments of joy, though, that kept me tethered. Ethan could be unexpectedly kind, sending me flowers when my code finally worked, after days of frustration, staying up until 3 a.m. to help me troubleshoot a glitch. I knew he cared, deeply, in his own way. But I also started noticing the tension behind his smiles. Little sighs when I spoke about work, eyes darting when I mentioned deadlines. The enthusiasm that had drawn me to him seemed overshadowed by expectations I couldn't, or wouldn't, meet. Looking back, the signs were there all along. The subtle critiques, the comparisons to colleagues' partners, the questions about why I wasn't more ambitious. Yet I ignored them, chalking it up to his protective concern, to the kind of subtle pressure couples sometimes put on each other. I didn't realize then that I was slowly being measured, evaluated, and found wanting in a system that had nothing to do with love. By the time I walked into that coffee shop yesterday and saw him with Courtney, everything crystallized. All the teasing, the judgment, the casual dismissal, it had been leading to that moment. And yet, beneath the sting of humiliation, there was a quiet understanding. I had never been the person who needed approval to prove my worth. I had built my own path, and no one could take that from me. It started subtly, like a faint shadow at the edge of my vision, barely noticeable at first. Ethan would glance at his phone a little too often during dinner, laugh at texts, and hide the screen when I looked. His once open, warm demeanor felt guarded, almost rehearsed. I tried to rationalize it. Everyone needs privacy, I told myself. But deep down, a seed of unease had been planted. Our friends noticed it too. At a small weekend gathering, Jordan, my closest confidant, leaned in and whispered, "He seems different lately. Are you okay?" I forced a laugh, brushing it off. I didn't want to admit the tiny cracks I was seeing, the pangs of doubt that gnawed at the edges of my happiness. I loved Ethan. I had invested too much to question him openly. Then came the family dinners. His mother, always so charming in public, had a way of prying without seeming intrusive. "Emily, don't you think you should aim for something more conventional?" she asked, casually, as if it were a compliment. His sister, a sweet but blunt young woman, asked why I didn't have an office job, why I didn't network like other young professionals. I explained my app projects, my long-term vision, but their smiles never wavered. There was always a flicker of disappointment in their eyes, subtle but cutting. Ethan's own behavior grew inconsistent. He would compliment my work one day, then criticize me for spending too many hours on it the next. "I just don't want you to waste your potential," he'd say, his voice calm, persuasive. But the truth was, it never felt like encouragement. It felt like judgment. And the more I tried to show him my passion, the more he seemed uncomfortable with it. I started replaying moments in my head, the holiday party 3 months ago, for instance, where he introduced me to his colleagues as between opportunities, ignoring all the late nights and breakthroughs I had achieved with TaskFlow. I asked him later, gently, "Why did you say that?" And he shrugged. "What am I supposed to tell them? That you dropped out and work from home?" His words lingered like a bruise I couldn't touch. Little things compounded. Texts left on read, last-minute cancellations, vague excuses when he disappeared for hours. Ethan's friend group, usually warm and inclusive, began making comments about people who don't seem to have direction. I could feel the social pressure tightening around me, like water rising in a slowly filling room. I didn't want to admit it, but I was drowning in expectations that weren't mine. And yet, beneath all the frustration and worry, there was still love. I clung to it stubbornly, reminding myself of the laughter, the quiet support, the moments when he truly saw me. But the tension between what I knew of myself and what he and his family expected of me was becoming undeniable. By the time I realized that my feelings of unease weren't just paranoia, but a pattern, the seed of conflict had fully sprouted. The arguments hadn't started yet, but the undercurrents were there. Judgment, disappointment, hidden criticism, and the gnawing sense that no matter what I did, it would never be enough for Ethan or the people around him. I remember sitting alone in my apartment one evening, staring at my laptop and thinking, am I the problem? Or am I finally seeing the truth about him? The answer wasn't clear, but the tension was unmistakable. The cracks were forming, and I knew deep down that if I didn't pay attention, they would widen into something much harder to fix. The day it all hit me, I was sitting at my favorite corner in Roasted Bean Coffee Shop, fingers hovering over my laptop keyboard, immersed in the latest updates for TaskFlow. The air smelled faintly of roasted coffee beans and cinnamon, the kind of comforting scent that usually put me at ease. But that day, it felt like a thin veil, barely hiding the storm waiting to crash into my life. I looked up and froze. Ethan walked in, holding Courtney's hand, the two of them smiling and chatting casually, completely unaware, or so I thought, that I was there. My stomach twisted in that instant, a knot of dread and disbelief. Ethan's eyes met mine, and instead of a polite nod, a simple acknowledgement, he pointed. Loudly, deliberately so that everyone nearby could hear, "This is my ex, a worthless community college dropout." The words struck me harder than any blow could. I felt my chest tighten, my heartbeat spiking, my palms sweating on the table. Courtney shifted uncomfortably beside him, glancing around the cafe as if the whole scene were a mistake he hadn't signed up for. I wanted to disappear, to vanish into the floorboards, but I stayed, rooted, trying to ground myself in the rhythm of my breath. Ethan continued, oblivious to, or perhaps ignoring, the humiliation he was causing. "Trading up to someone with class, someone with a real future," he said, gesturing to Courtney. "Not someone like this." The world seemed to blur at the edges as I processed the public shaming. My throat felt dry, my voice stuck somewhere behind my ribs. The humiliation was sharp, piercing, but there was something else beneath it, a familiar ache of betrayal, deeper than embarrassment. I closed my laptop gently and looked up, catching Courtney's eye. He looked torn, uncomfortable, embarrassed by the very display Ethan orchestrated. A small part of me wanted to reach out to him, to whisper that it didn't have to be like this, but I knew better. My anger, my shock, needed air. I took a deep breath and met Ethan's gaze, calm but cutting. "Hope you're happy," I said, my voice steady, though my chest felt heavy. Ethan smiled, smug. "Oh, I am. Finally with someone who has real ambition, someone with credentials that matter." The words dripped with satisfaction, as if he had just passed judgment on my entire life. Every fiber of my being screamed, but I forced myself to remain composed. I had worked too hard, built too much, to let his arrogance define me. And then, the cruel irony struck me. While he mocked me for my lack of credentials, he had no idea that the very company he worked for, the one he bragged about being part of, relied every day on something I had created. TaskFlow, my productivity app, was embedded into their operations, used by the marketing department, praised by management, unknowingly facilitating the very work Ethan and Courtney admired. I could feel the mix of emotions coursing through me, rage, disbelief, heartbreak, but also a strange, quiet triumph. I realized in that instant that his mockery was built on ignorance, on assumptions, and the truth, when it came to light, would be a reckoning he hadn't even imagined. Courtney leaned slightly toward Ethan, murmuring, "Maybe we should just order and sit." But Ethan wasn't finished. He gestured again, louder this time. "I want you to see what I used to settle for. This is what happens when you don't have standards." I kept my eyes on my coffee, letting the calm veneer mask the storm inside me. My fingers drummed lightly against the table as my mind raced. Every humiliating word, every smirk, every glance filled me with a fierce, burning awareness. The love I had poured into this relationship had not been enough to change him. The respect I had shown him, the trust, the care, it hadn't mattered. And yet, even in that moment of public humiliation, I felt something else, a clarity, a flicker of understanding. I was not broken. I was not worthless. Ethan's words were a reflection of him, not me, and the path ahead, however painful, would be mine to navigate. After Ethan's words echoed through the coffee shop, I felt my body go cold. My chest ached, a tightness that made it hard to breathe, and my fingers trembled slightly as I gripped the edge of the table. Around me, the hum of conversation and clinking of cups became a distant noise, like I was underwater. Every eye in the cafe felt like it was dissecting me, judging me, and yet the person whose judgment mattered most, Ethan, was the one I couldn't stop replaying in my mind. I sipped my coffee slowly, forcing my hands to stop shaking. My mind ran in loops, asking the same question over and over. How could he say that about me? After everything we shared, after all the nights I stayed up helping him with his work, after all the times I supported his dreams. The answer felt cruelly simple. He had never really seen me. Or maybe he had, and what he saw wasn't enough to satisfy his own standards. I thought back to the early months, to the laughter and late-night conversations, to the warmth of his hand in mine. How had it shifted into this, mockery and judgment? The sting of betrayal wasn't just about his words. It was about the erasure of my efforts, the disregard for my existence beyond the labels he deemed important. Worthless, he had said. That word lodged in my chest, heavy and suffocating. And yet, amidst the heartbreak, a quiet voice inside reminded me, you are not what he says you are. The apps I had built, the countless hours of coding, the problems solved, the companies benefiting from my work, it all existed. My achievements didn't vanish just because he refused to see them. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that thought anchor me, even as the humiliation lingered like a shadow at the back of my mind. I couldn't just let this go unexamined. There was a question I needed to answer. Had I ignored signs? Had I missed warnings? The subtle glances, the critiques masked as concern, the comparisons to other men he admired, they weren't harmless jokes. They were seeds of judgment planted in the soil of our relationship, and I had allowed them to take root. A part of me wanted confrontation, a direct, blazing reckoning. I imagined standing in front of him, laying every hurt bare, asking how he could reduce 18 months to a single insult. But another part, a quieter, more strategic part, recognized that explosive reactions could only give him the upper hand. I needed clarity before action, composure before confrontation. I texted Jordan quietly, explaining the situation, not in anger, but in need of perspective. He humiliated me, in front of everyone. I don't know if I should respond or just let it go. His reply was immediate, supportive, but blunt. Don't let him rewrite your worth. You've built things he'll never understand. Hold your ground. The coffee shop felt heavier with each passing minute, the hum of normal life continuing around me as if oblivious to my inner storm. Every glance at Ethan and Courtney reminded me that they had no idea of the truth, that their perception of me was skewed by ignorance and pride. And yet, there was something powerful in that realization. The humiliation, though sharp, could not erase the foundation I had laid for myself, the work I had poured into my future. I finally took a deep breath, steadying my trembling hands. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but now it had a direction. It wasn't destructive, it was clarifying. I need to face this. I need to reclaim my narrative. I need to show, not tell, that my worth isn't dictated by him. By the time Ethan and Courtney left the cafe, I was already planning my next steps. Not out of spite, not for revenge, but for my own dignity and self-respect. I would confront him, yes, but on my terms, with the clarity and strength that he had tried to undermine. This was no longer about proving anything to him. It was about reclaiming my own power. In the days following that coffee shop incident, the world around me felt heavier, like gravity had doubled. The humiliation wasn't confined to that tiny corner of the cafe. It had begun seeping into every interaction, every message, every lingering glance. Ethan's family, as if sensing weakness, subtly began inserting themselves into our already fragile dynamic. His mother called almost daily, casually asking questions about my career path, my plans, and every answer I gave seemed to fall short. "You really don't think you should consider a more stable job?" she asked during one phone call, her tone syrupy sweet but loaded with judgment. I gritted my teeth, forcing a polite laugh. "I'm focusing on my app development right now," I said evenly, but the pause on her side of the line told me she was unimpressed. She hadn't changed. She just doubled down on subtle pressure. Ethan, meanwhile, seemed to revel in this unspoken alliance. Texts that used to be playful became sharp and pointed. "You really think working from home is going to get you anywhere?" he asked once, knowing full well I was finishing a major update for TaskFlow. He framed his concern as caring, but it cut sharper than a knife. Courtney, the new girlfriend, was present in our social circles, and his polite unease only added fuel to the fire. Ethan seemed to thrive on the performance of superiority, and Courtney, intentionally or not, became an audience member to my suffering. Mutual friends started noticing the tension too. At a dinner hosted by Jordan and his partner, whispers circled about my choices and Ethan's concerns. I caught a few friends exchanging glances, subtle gestures that spoke volumes. It was a slow crescendo, a social orchestra conducting my public and private humiliation. Comments about ambition, stability, and proper career paths floated around the table, veiled as concern, but loaded with implicit judgment. Then came the subtle but devastating reminders of TaskFlow's success, things I hadn't yet shared with anyone outside my inner circle. Vale, a colleague from Ethan's company who had become a quiet supporter of my work, reached out with updates I hadn't anticipated. TaskFlow's user base was expanding. The software was being integrated deeper into Ethan's own department, and management was thrilled with the results. I read her messages with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. The very company that shamed me daily was relying on my creation to function efficiently. I could feel the irony gnawing at my chest. Every time Ethan bragged about the company's productivity or subtly compared me to colleagues, partners with real careers, I knew the truth. My work was underpinning the very systems he lauded. The dissonance was maddening. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to deliver a cutting truth, but another part, quieter yet surer, knew that patience would be my weapon. The escalation reached its peak during a lunch meeting where Ethan, uninvitedly, brought up my educational background in front of colleagues. "I just don't understand why someone would drop out and work from home," he said with a forced chuckle. I felt the old burn of humiliation rise like bile in my throat, but I stayed seated, controlled, letting the conversation continue while I quietly typed notes on my laptop. I documented the slights, the subtle digs, the hypocrisy. It was during that same week that I realized I was beginning to change. The humiliation, the judgment, and the passive aggression were forging a new strength inside me. Where I had once sought approval, I now found resolve. Where I had felt small, I began to measure my own worth against my accomplishments, not the narrow metrics of grades or office titles. TaskFlow was more than a project. It was proof of my vision, my discipline, and my capacity to create tangible impact. Even Ethan's friends, those who once nodded politely at his criticisms, began questioning the narrative he had spun. Small comments, offhanded remarks about my software started cropping up. "I didn't realize Emily created this," one colleague said. Another whispered about TaskFlow's influence during meetings. The tide, subtle at first, began to shift. I began to confront myself in quiet moments, asking the hard questions. Why did I tolerate this for so long? Why did I bend to someone else's definition of worth? Each reflection deepened my understanding. I realized that Ethan's behavior was never about me personally. It was about his obsession with status, with appearances, with control, masked as guidance. And as I started asserting my boundaries in small ways, sitting taller, speaking with firmer tones, refusing to justify my life choices, I noticed the reactions. Ethan grew impatient, frustrated by my newfound composure. His family, too, seemed unsettled, no longer able to nudge me as easily. Even Courtney looked uneasy, caught between loyalty to Ethan and a growing recognition that I was not the person they had been belittling. By the end of the week, the social and professional pressures had intensified, but I was no longer the same person who had walked into that coffee shop humiliated. I was stronger, sharper, aware of my own value, and more prepared than ever for the confrontation I knew was inevitable. The stage was set for a reckoning, not through rage, but through clarity, self-respect, and undeniable proof of what I had built. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the city lights flickering through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. The hum of the world outside felt distant, irrelevant, as if my life had been put on pause and everyone else was moving on without me. I cradled my mug of cold tea, staring at the condensation, letting the chill seep into my bones. The humiliation from the coffee shop incident still burned, but now it mingled with something heavier. The creeping, suffocating realization that someone I had loved, someone I had trusted with my heart and dreams, had not only judged me, but taken joy in my perceived inferiority. Ethan's words, his performance for Courtney, the nodding approval from his friends, his family, every layer pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. I thought about my achievements, TaskFlow, the countless hours I had poured into coding, problem solving, building something real. And yet, in his eyes, none of it mattered. He hadn't understood, hadn't even tried. For 18 months, I had given him the best parts of myself, and he had repaid me with public mockery and passive aggression. The betrayal cut deeper than any insult because it came from someone I had considered a partner, a teammate in life. Tears came unbidden. I buried my face in my hands, feeling the trembling of my shoulders, the lump in my throat. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make the pain tangible and visible. But the apartment was empty. There was no one to witness my collapse, no one to intervene, no one to say, "You are not alone." And for the first time in months, I felt completely, utterly alone. Memories flooded me. The laughter we had shared, the late-night talks about dreams and fears, the way his hand fit perfectly in mine. Each memory was now tinged with betrayal, a cruel reminder of what had been and what had been lost. I realized that I had been nurturing a relationship with someone who fundamentally didn't see me for who I was. I had been living in a shadow of someone else's expectations, bending myself to fit a mold I had never agreed to. The darkness pressed on. I questioned everything, my choices, my judgment, my instincts. Why didn't I see the signs sooner? Why did I ignore the subtle digs, the criticisms, the dismissive smiles? The questions had no answers, only echoes of regret and shame. It felt like I was falling slowly, endlessly, into a pit with no bottom. But amid the despair, there was a small, stubborn spark, my own voice, whispering in the recesses of my mind. You are not what he says you are. You are not defined by his judgment. I clung to that thought, fragile and flickering, like a candle in a storm. It didn't erase the pain, but it gave me something to hold on to. I thought about the friends who had tried to support me, Jordan, Vale, even Courtney in his awkward way. They reminded me that not everyone saw me through Ethan's distorted lens. There was still connection, still recognition of my worth somewhere in the world, and for the first time that night, I felt a tiny measure of clarity. This was not the end of me. I pulled my laptop toward me and opened TaskFlow, my sanctuary, my creation. Each line of code, each feature, each problem solved reminded me that I had built something valuable, something real. I realized then that my strength wasn't dependent on Ethan's approval or his perception of me. It had always been inside me, quietly growing, waiting for the right moment to assert itself. For hours, I sat in that dimly lit apartment, letting the emotions wash over me. I allowed myself to feel the betrayal, the shame, the loneliness, but I also allowed myself to remember my own power. By the time dawn crept over the horizon, casting pale light across the room, I felt a quiet determination settle in my chest. The darkness hadn't consumed me. It had tempered me. I was broken, yes, but not defeated. The storm had passed, leaving me raw, but also awake. I knew that a reckoning was coming, that the truth would surface, and that I would face it, not with anger alone, but with clarity, confidence, and the unshakable knowledge of my own worth. The morning after my darkest night, sunlight spilled into my apartment, warm and sharp, cutting through the shadows in a way that felt almost symbolic. I opened my laptop, still raw from the night before, and began reviewing the latest analytics for TaskFlow. But something in my inbox caught my eye. A message from Vale, marked urgent. Emily, it began, you need to see this. Ember is presenting TaskFlow to the whole department tomorrow. She doesn't know you're the founder. This is going to be interesting. I froze. Ember, my ex, the same person who had humiliated me publicly, was about to unknowingly elevate the very work I had created. My heartbeat quickened. Part of me ached at the absurdity of the situation, but another part felt a thrill of anticipation. This was the moment where the truth could no longer be hidden. I spent the morning meticulously preparing. I reviewed every project milestone, every user testimonial, every corporate email praising TaskFlow's impact. Each piece of evidence reinforced what I had long known, but Ethan and Ember had refused to acknowledge. My work had value, measurable and undeniable. Later that afternoon, Vale called to give me more context. She's going to pitch TaskFlow to her team as some revolutionary tool she discovered. She has no idea who created it. The irony, it's almost poetic. I laughed quietly, the sound trembling, but genuine. It was poetic indeed, but also empowering. This wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity, about reclaiming the narrative that had been twisted for so long. That evening, I made a decision. I would confront Ethan, not with shouting or tears, but with facts and calm authority. I would reclaim my dignity and show him that I was not defined by his opinions or by Ember's mockery. I typed out the message carefully, each word precise. Ethan, I want to clarify something before tomorrow. TaskFlow isn't just any app, it's my creation. You, your friends, and even Ember have underestimated it and, in turn, underestimated me. Tomorrow, the truth will speak for itself. I sent it and waited, letting the tension build. The next day, I entered Ember's company via video conference for the presentation, a scheduled segment she hadn't been expecting. The marketing team buzzed with curiosity, unaware of the layers unfolding. I joined the call calmly, projecting professionalism and quiet confidence. As Ember began to speak, extolling TaskFlow's revolutionary features, I watched her gestures and expressions closely. There was pride in her voice, enthusiasm in her eyes, but none of it recognized me. Then I unmuted myself, introducing clearly, "Hello, everyone. I'm Emily Foster, founder of TaskFlow. I wanted to personally thank your team for the support and feedback, which has helped us improve the app tremendously. I also wanted to clarify a few points about our roadmap and enterprise features you'll find useful." The room went silent. Faces turned, some registering shock, others awe. Ember froze, her presentation momentarily forgotten. Her eyes widened as she looked directly at me through the camera. I continued, voice steady but warm, walking them through the features, explaining the updates, highlighting successes, and referencing their own internal feedback. Each fact, each data point, each validation was undeniable. I wasn't there to embarrass her. I was there to show the truth, and the truth couldn't be ignored. By the end of the call, the team was engaged, asking questions, making notes, visibly impressed. Ember sat rigid, flushed, unable to speak. I could feel the power in that room shift, not through anger, but through undeniable reality. I had reclaimed my narrative without shouting, without tearing anyone down. My success, my vision, my work spoke for itself. After the conference, Vale called me quietly. "They're talking about this everywhere. Ember, she's processing, but everyone else sees it. You handled that perfectly." I exhaled, a mixture of relief, pride, and a strange satisfaction settling in my chest. Ethan, of course, was the hardest to reach. I knew the confrontation with him would come later, but the turning point had already occurred. I recognized my own worth, independent of his opinions. The humiliation, the pressure, the mockery, they no longer defined me. I had power, clarity, and undeniable proof of my value. I spent the evening alone, letting the reality sink in. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. The dark night had passed, and I had emerged stronger, sharper, and ready to face the final reckoning. The next steps would require courage, yes, but I had already won the most important battle, belief in myself. The morning after the presentation, the atmosphere around Ethan and Ember shifted in ways I hadn't expected. The air seemed lighter, almost as if gravity had been lifted from my shoulders, while the world they had built around assumptions and social hierarchy began to crumble quietly but irrevocably. Ember's coworkers no longer whispered compliments or sly jokes about my supposed failures. Instead, there was a new tone, curiosity, cautious admiration, and, in some corners, disbelief. The same people who had once nodded politely at her jabs now turned their attention to the reality of the software she had championed, only to discover that I was the creator. A few whispered to each other, faces registering shock, recognition, and a touch of vindication on my behalf. I watched from my apartment as social media activity exploded. Screenshots of the presentation, paired with colleagues' astonished reactions, circulated rapidly. Mutual friends tagged Ember, gently hinting at the revelation. "Did you know Emily was the founder all along?" "Interesting twist about TaskFlow, she's the one behind it." Each notification I received reminded me that the truth could no longer be ignored. Ember's response was telling. She went from initial shock to frantic messages, calling and texting in rapid succession. "Emily, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me this? You made me look like a fool in front of everyone. How could you keep this from me? We should have." I read the messages calmly, letting them settle like pebbles in a pond. I typed a reply that was concise, measured, and final. "I never hid my work from you, Ember. You simply never asked. You assumed I was a failure and acted accordingly. The presentation spoke for itself. I hope you can process that." The effect on Ember's social standing at work was immediate. Colleagues who had once silently agreed with her criticisms now questioned her judgment, her perception, and her credibility. Subtle murmurs became open comments. One marketing teammate said quietly to another, "I can't believe she mocked the founder of the app we use every day." Another remarked on her impulsive social media posts, which suddenly appeared more naive than calculated. Ethan's world, too, began to shift. The subtle authority he wielded, the respect he assumed, started to erode. Friends who had once aligned with him, gently poking at my supposed shortcomings, now kept their distance. The conversations that once celebrated my perceived failure became awkward, hushed, or abruptly ended when I entered the room. Some mutual friends privately reached out to check on me, expressing regret over having doubted or underestimated me. And yet, I did not gloat. I did not send another message to further humiliate them or post vindictive updates online. The irony of the situation was intoxicating enough. The satisfaction was internal, quiet, and profound. My triumph lay not in revenge, but in truth. Unquestionable, undeniable, and publicly recognized. Ember, after days of frantic texts and calls, attempted a reconciliation with Ethan, hoping to reestablish the image of control she had cultivated, but he had seen enough. Crew, Ethan's corporate partner and friend, quietly conveyed his own perspective to her, emphasizing the ethical and professional missteps she had made. Her credibility with him weakened, her influence waned, and her attempts at reclaiming social dominance were largely ignored. At work, she requested transfers, attempted to redirect projects away from task flow, and sought subtle ways to regain footing, but the narrative had shifted. The world she had mocked was thriving because of my efforts. I, meanwhile, took deliberate steps to disengage. I continued my work from home, still in comfortable clothes, still focused on building, innovating, and expanding task flow. I declined calls that weren't essential, didn't engage in gossip, and avoided public appearances designed to showcase my victory. The satisfaction I derived came from a place of self-respect and clarity. I had not been defined by their opinions, nor had I allowed their misjudgment to derail me. Socially, I maintained a polite distance. Friends who had questioned my choices in the past began to reach out, expressing newfound respect and curiosity. Offers for collaborations, speaking engagements, and partnerships started appearing. People now saw me for what I had always been: competent, innovative, and capable. Ethan attempted a conversation one evening, hesitating at my door. He seemed unsure, a shadow of the confidence he had once wielded so freely. "Emily, can we talk?" he asked cautiously. I looked at him, taking in his tone, his posture, and the subtle regret in his eyes. I shook my head gently. "Ethan," I said calmly, "there's nothing left to discuss. I know my worth now, and it isn't defined by your approval or Ember's. I hope you understand that." He nodded, silently acknowledging the truth he had long resisted. I closed the door softly, feeling the weight lift entirely. For the first time in months, I felt fully autonomous, untethered from the shadows of their judgment, humiliation, and social manipulation. By the end of the week, Ember had quietly deleted her social media accounts, requesting a department transfer at work to escape the daily reminders of her misjudgment. Ethan's friends slowly adjusted, some maintaining distance, others reconsidering their perceptions. The fallout was complete, but I remained untouched by malice, untouched by the desire for revenge. I walked away with my dignity intact, my work flourishing, and my confidence unshakable. The world had delivered justice through truth, not spectacle, and I had emerged not just victorious, but transformed. Weeks later, I found myself back in my apartment, the sunlight spilling across the familiar space, warm and reassuring. The chaos of the past months, the humiliation, the betrayal, the public spectacle, had settled into a story I could tell myself with clarity rather than pain. I brewed a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the city wake up, feeling an unexpected peace in my chest. Task flow continued to grow, with new partnerships, user feedback, and opportunities that stretched my abilities in exciting ways. Each success was quiet, understated, yet deeply satisfying. Unlike before, my achievements no longer needed validation from anyone else. They existed as tangible proof of my dedication, skill, and resilience. More importantly, I had reclaimed myself. I no longer measured my worth through Ethan's or Ember's opinions. I had faced the abyss of doubt and humiliation and emerged stronger. I had learned that true self-respect isn't declared through confrontation or revenge. It is lived, quietly, consistently, in the choices we make, the work we pursue, and the boundaries we enforce. Reflecting on the experience, I realized how easy it is to let others define our narratives, how often we allow criticism, assumptions, or jealousy to dictate our sense of self. I had once doubted myself, internalized their judgment, and felt smaller than I was. But the truth, the undeniable truth of my work, my values, and my vision had always been my anchor. I thought about the irony of it all. Ember had spent months mocking me while relying unknowingly on my creation. Ethan had assumed I lacked ambition, failing to see the quiet determination I poured into building my life. And yet, none of it diminished me. Their opinions had been loud, but my reality was louder. I smiled softly, feeling a sense of closure and renewal. Life had tested me, humiliated me, and even frightened me, but it had also clarified what mattered. Character, creativity, integrity, and perseverance. These were the measures of true success, not appearances, social status, or the approval of others. I picked up my laptop and returned to work, focused, energized, and unshakable. I knew there would be challenges ahead, competition, doubt, setbacks, but I also knew I could face them with the knowledge that my worth is self-defined. As I closed the window, letting in the fresh morning air, I whispered to myself, never let anyone else write your story. Your achievements, your dreams, and your strength belong to you alone. And with that, I stepped fully into the next chapter of my life, confident, empowered, and free.